Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in a changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow @ClimateDiplo on Twitter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 42 of the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, where we will bring you the answer to life, the universe, and everything.
What a strong start. Thanks so much to everyone who sent us questions. We've tried to bundle questions together that have similar topics, so if you don't hear your specific question, do know that it will be addressed as part of a theme, but let's just get right into it. So I guess a seemingly simple question to start us off. What is climate security, Raquel?
What is climate security, Alex? Yeah, this may seem like a simple question, but we actually got it more than once. And I guess this reflects the fact that we take it for granted. We work with it, we talk about it every day, but it might not be as simple as that. I mean, how many times did you have to explain to your family and friends, what do you exactly work with? What is it again?
Many times.
Many times, yeah. I still have to explain again. So yeah, let's get this out of the way so that we can also, lean on this for the rest of the episode, because we're going to continue talking about it, of course. Climate security is the short way to referring to how climate change interacts with security. For example, when a climate impact will lead to food insecurity, water insecurity, also other things like political instability, conflict, etc. So if you are a listener and you're looking for concrete examples of how climate interacts with insecurity, you can basically read any of our reports or listen to any of our podcast episodes. This is the number one thing we talk about. You will listen to so many examples, region-specific, country-specific, social group-specific, even at times. But in a nutshell, climate security refers to the interaction between these two, climate and the security, how they influence each other, how they impact each other, how they trigger each other.
That's also a good thing to mention off the bat is really we're called the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, but so much now we do focus on climate security specifically in the majority of our episodes. And touching on your point of, okay, how do we explain the work and how do we explain the topics to friends, family, even people who work in similar fields, but maybe not the same exact niche that we're working in. And one thing that's helped me discussing climate security, both with family and friends, and like I mentioned, different stakeholders, different actors, people in fields that we should be working with and we should be talking to, is from the start being explicit about the different dimensions of security. And in our work and within our analytical frameworks, like I bet all our listeners have heard Weathering Risk and the Initiative more than a handful of times on this podcast, but we approach security using the concept of human security, a more people-centered approach to cover the topics like you mentioned, from food security to political instability, conflict, etc., and focusing on things like economic, health, environmental, community security, and things like that. And that, of course, doesn't mean to say that we never work with traditional security actors, or these aren't conversations that are happening in the climate security space of, okay, how do we all kind of speak the same language, especially when the nature of security threats is changing in the world we live in. But I always find it very helpful to enter talking about human security and kind of defining this off the start.
That's a very good way to put it, because a lot of the questions that came up for this episode had to do with misconceptions. And I think the word security does bring up a lot of misconception. So I think like just making this point very strongly that it is people-centered and that we're talking about human security first and foremost, even though other things may come up, that is the main focus, really helps to set the tone also for the rest of the conversations we will have today in answering the other questions that came up. For example, the next question is, what is the difference between insecurity, fragility, and vulnerability in the climate context?
Oh, this is a very good one. And I think We often use these terms almost seemingly interchangeably or within the same breath when we say fragile and conflict affected context, or in some of these phrases that I guess are a bit jargony that we probably take for granted when we say them so many times a day. But maybe let's start with then insecurity. So when we speak of insecurity, we're specifically speaking of impacts, in particular, impacts stemming from climate change. We're talking about political instability, organized crime, violence, terrorism, and violent conflict, and different ways in which insecurity manifests itself, and multiple kinds of instability occur simultaneously, how they interact with each other. Our different approaches to climate security and the frameworks always include all of these aspects. And there's a lot of ways that climate change can impact people, and if not all related to this aspect of human security that we already kind of talked about, in some ways, some examples from which people are suffering from hunger or are forced to flee, or when they're caught up in violence and conflicts related to things like resource competition or post-disaster settings, if they're in those contexts. And now, fragility. I think often, especially within weathering risk, we do talk about instability and fragility kind of as one phrase. And we use the OECD definition, the combination of exposure to risk and insufficient coping capacity of things like state, systems, and communities to manage or mitigate all these risks. And I'm sure that it's been spoken many times that climate change isn't directly causing insecurity. One of the things that we always say is that climate and security indirectly correlate because it's not this automatic kind of relationship of, okay, a climate impact is immediately leading to hunger or conflict. And for this to happen, other factors need to be in place, like how I mentioned, weak governance, and specific things like lacking alternative livelihood options. And this is kind of the whole premise of our pathway methodology that we really like to talk about so much here within the podcast. And in fragile states, these factors can help translate a climate impact into insecurity. All these dynamics are usually already in place. So when climate change hits, insecurity almost always follows.
Exactly. This really helps me also understand fragility. It's like something that was already there before even the climate impact hits, right? It's not necessarily related to climate. We have the state fragility. It's a term that already exists. You have like indexes and everything to measure that. First talking without the climate, and then comes climate on top. It kind of helps me differentiate between that kind of other terms that we use.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. And then I think the last terminology here was vulnerability, which is, I think, a term most commonly related to the extent to which a country, region, or even a community can withstand these climate impacts. And we always talk about context factors, and those are shaping vulnerabilities. I imagine that we'll talk about context factors again in this episode, so we can play a bit of buzzword bingo. So here, listen out for it. And here, the human security aspect is generally not referred to just vulnerability to the climate impact itself, although it's not uncommon for these two to overlap, particularly in least developed countries. And from the policy perspective, one can say that vulnerability as a term is most commonly associated with climate adaptation and resilience strategies, where, as we talked about, fragility is often talked about within the humanitarian spaces or the HDP, humanitarian development and peace nexus. Not always, but often.
Yeah, often difficult to separate, right? But
Yeah,
they're a
very
little
difficult.
bit, they overlap so much, but
Yeah.
a little bit difficult for
Yeah.
different
There's
policy for sure.
definitely a reason why this question popped up amongst our listeners. And I think it's definitely important that we have these kinds of definitions and the ability to separate things to certain extents. But we're also not academics on this subject. So a little bit more focus on what this actually means in action and what it means in actually addressing some of these climate security related risks and challenges.
Absolutely. I guess the policy relevance. And also like a little bit in the same theme of wordings and definitions. The next question is, why have we been seeing the phrasing climate peace and security being used lately more often rather than just climate security? I really love this question. And I think it's because the climate security field has been developing like all the other fields. And in recent years, it has developed in a very specific direction, namely, it's becoming much clearer for the community that climate change is not only bearing risks for security. I mean, we know that it does, but it's more than that. It also brings opportunities for peace. And those are different things because the one side, you have these two sides of the same coin. So if a climate impact can trigger a situation of insecurity, then of course, if you mitigate that impact, you can reduce the likelihood of that insecurity situation from happening, of course. But you can also go beyond this, just eliminating risks and having, for example, let's say a climate strategy, it's being implemented in a context that already has a history of conflict. This climate strategy can then be designed to contain peace-building elements so that it can actually also drive conflict resolution and peace, besides climate mitigation or whatever was its original purpose. So it can have these added benefits. For example, it can bring conflicting parties together to work on solutions. It can address factors that were influencing conflict, lacking economic opportunities or the marginalization of social groups. So it is important to have the word peace in there to make this even clearer.
Definitely. I really, really like this question. I think often climate risks and talking about it from this perspective can just seem like, okay, we're outlining all of these things that can go wrong. Whereas looking at it from a peace perspective to me feels a little bit more, not tangible, but it feels a little bit more action oriented and actionable in that sense of,
Definitely.
okay, we can
Solutions.
actually,
Solution.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, because when I talk about it being actionable, that also can translate into prevention measures and things like that. But it also gives a sense of agency of, okay, we can take these opportunities and we can actually work to create better solutions. And one example of this is the Climate for Peace initiative. And I was just thinking about this other day because Laiz and I got Andorra and their project submission up on the website. And I was looking at the 7-point agenda for action, and that outlines some aspects of the initiative that cover different opportunities like mobilizing climate and biodiversity finance for peace and looking at ways that these things can work together, as well as things like integrating climate change and environmental degradation and their impacts into things like early warning, mediation, peacekeeping, and other peace support operations to make these things more sustainable and more resilient as climate change and its impacts potentially like get worse and get more frequent in the future. And in order to promote resilience and to avoid this vicious cycle where climate change and environmental degradation worsen these drivers of conflict and in turn also increase vulnerability to climate change and degradation in the future. The initiative promotes active exchange of information, experiences, and best practices, and helps coordinate available resources and needs and administers this platform that we have to showcase these project examples, best practices, and lessons learned. And I think this peace framing helps kind of create this momentum towards that. And like you mentioned, some examples of projects are things like the Weathering Risk Peace Pillar that is doing a lot of these things of integrating climate change into peacemaking and also peace building to help create more sustainable projects. So now we've talked a bit about this framing and evolution of climate security into climate peace and security. Where does environment kind of feature in this context? We always say climate, climate, climate. What about the environment?
That's a difficult question. And actually, it all started with the environment, right? In the 70s or up until the 90s, it was just environment until we had the Rio conventions and then climate came up. And now we just talk about climate. It's true. But climate and environment are definitely not the same thing. I say it's a difficult question because actually separating them into distinct narratives, it's a real challenge. Just to give an example why I find it challenging, if you're thinking of deforestation, would you say it's a climate issue or it's an environmental issue?
Great question.
It's land degradation. Okay, you have land degradation caused by agricultural activity. Like what is it? It's very difficult. They're both so associated with the carbon, the ecosystem degradation. It's all very interlinked and difficult to separate. It's definitely both. So it's not uncommon for people to say one thing, but actually they mean both. Particularly if you're speaking about impact, you're generally speaking of both. But the real distinction, it actually happens when you talk about policies, because if you're going to make a policy to address climate change or a policy to address environmental degradation, they are going to be very different. Even if in the end there will be an impact for both, they will still be initially very different. So for example, if there's a policy on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the industry sector, this is a clear climate mitigation approach. No one's necessarily thinking about the environment. But of course, if it's helping to reduce the rate of temperature increase, you're also doing something for ecosystems, for biodiversity, right? So there is an impact also for environment. But it's not primarily, it doesn't really pop up on the core of that policy, maybe as a co-benefit, but not as a core. And looking from the other direction, if you're putting together strategies for landscape restoration, reforestation, or maybe even more environment specific, like the rehabilitation of wildlife or the spaces that wildlife need to thrive. Those are all clear environmental measures, but of course have very climate specific benefits like carbon sequestration. And I think this kind of overlapping and this difficulty to separate them also comes up in the security context, because you have both climate change and environmental degradation interacting with insecurity, and also both offering opportunities for peace. There are a few ways in which environmental security can be, let's say, fairly good, well separated from climate. So, for example, if we're speaking of environmental crime, like wildlife trade or illegal mining, and how the revenue that stems from these activities can be used to finance armed groups and international crime, this is a very clear environmental security aspect. Another example would be the weaponization of war in a conflict context, which we know happens a lot, or of soil. But of course, also these activities have interactions with climate impacts in one way or another. I guess whoever asked this question, I will leave you with this. If you want to know more about how environmental security interacting specifically without having it completely entangled with climate, having it a little bit more separate, there are not a lot of resources out there that actually do this. This is why we worked with WWF on a report with this purpose. This report is called The Nature of Conflict and Peace. You have a few pathways there. You have several examples, and there might be other resources out there. This is the one I know because I worked on it, so I'm very familiar with it. So if you're looking more into diving deeper into this, do take a look at this report, The Nature of Conflict and Peace.
And I guess now I'm not stuck on your last point before we go on to some of the other questions about methodologies and approaches. I guess your example of the weaponization of water in a conflict context, I guess climate change can also make that so much more severe, right? Where if water is being weaponized, that's a different situation, say, if a context has been experiencing severe drought in recent times.
It's much easier, and people are already much more fragile if there were consecutive droughts before that happened. Absolutely. It's separating them completely. It's almost impossible because it is one. Climate and environment is one thing, right? We're the ones who are trying to separate it.
Great. So now that I've blurred the lines a bit more after you've had a great explanation to try to kind of show the differences, how they interact together, now we did get a few questions that related to different things like methodology and approaches. And one question that we got quite a few times was, how do we know if a security risk is connected to a climate impact? And I think I stared at this question quite a bit and I was like, oh, but how do we prove it? And a few things
Proving is the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Our whole existence as climate and security consultants was just brought into question.
Exactly. We're building the evidence base, but it's very difficult to say we can prove something. And I think here, two things came to my mind right away when we got some of these questions was the importance of integrating a qualitative approach into these methodologies, as well as the importance of monitoring and evaluation. And I guess just chronologically, kind of in different methodological steps, to start off with the importance of a qualitative approach. I think that goes to show that oftentimes we have these different quantitative measures that are going to show us what the data is showing us. And these things are, of course, really important. Within the Weathering Risk Initiative, we often start with a climate risk or climate impact profile that provides data on a region's climate, summarizes projected climate projections related to sectoral impacts, things like that. And then we use these kinds of profiles as the basis for our assessments. And of course, those things go into things like the climate security pathways, things that our audience is likely very familiar with us talking about. And here, I think sometimes you can know if a security risk is connected to a climate impact by talking to people, which is why we, in our recent weathering risk methodology that includes a guide and tools, we actually have a few sets of different examples of research questions to ask people when doing field work or when partnering with an organization that's ingrained in that community to conduct this kind of work. And examples of the questions that we ask are very straightforward. Some examples we give are, what sudden changes like storms and floods are affecting the population and region? Or what are some of the slower, longer term effects of climate change in the region? Things like, how is temperature change and temperature increase playing out? More hot days, things related to ocean acidification. How is that changing things like fish supplies, land degradation, sea level rise? By asking people these questions, more oftentimes than not, they've made these connections. They're living these realities. And it always strikes me an example from our partner EIP, who works on the Yemen project that's part of the Weathering Risk Peace Pillar, is they do different surveys in order to get a sense of what local communities perceive as security threats. And I think to their surprise the first time around is that people had already identified how these things are related to the environment, are related to climate change. So I think, how do you know if a security risk is connected to a climate impact? First of all, you can ask people. And you can ask things differently, and there's a lot of different questions. Definitely check out the guide and tools for the methodology if you're conducting these kinds of assessments. But yeah.
I want to bring an example from when we were doing this workshop. Alina and I did this workshop
in Iraq
with the Weathering Risk Peace Pillar. And we talked a lot about this with the researchers that we're supposed to start doing interviews with communities about also how to ask the question, because you're going to come there and say, hey, are you being impacted by climate change? And a lot of people might not even really know what you mean or understand or not be connected to this particular narrative. Like they are so connected to their issues on the ground. So you have to ask questions that they relate to. How has your soil changed? Has your soil changed? How has your water changed? Or just in general, what has changed? And has it changed on a long term? Even like asking the right questions and try to get a little bit out of our head and our narrative, our terms, right?
Exactly. And sometimes it does mean asking quite a few questions, but eventually then you get a better picture of what's actually happening. What are people already perceiving and what are they experiencing? Because I think the data also can't tell us everything. It's really important that we talk to people who are living these realities. And that's, I think, equally important in this assessment approach. I think the other thing is monitoring and evaluation, which can sometimes be a bit of a black box when it comes to things like peace. How do we measure peace? And we could have an entire episode dedicated to that and how we do it. So I'll also just keep it relatively short for the purpose of this episode. But if people are also interested in these kinds of topics, even though episode 42 is our big themed Ask Us Anything, you can always submit different interesting topics or things that you would be really interested in hearing about. And when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, I'll just say a few very short things on theory of change and indicators. But it's important for monitoring and evaluation that you start with this theory of change, which, to avoid being incredibly jargony, but these are our hypotheses about why a certain action will produce a desired change. And this means For an integrated response to climate-related security risks, this theory of change describes how the intervention, the vulnerability to climate change prevents conflict, or vice versa, can also build peace. So it's kind of this if statement that you start out with, and then you get to a because and the expected function and what's desirable in this outcome. So in other words, monitoring what is a precondition for a particular action to have an expected change within the system. And these, to have a good theory of change, they should always clarify how and why the project will address climate security dynamics. And then lastly, just indicators are kind of the second building block for effective monitoring and evaluation. And responses to climate security risks, resilience that they build are multi-dimensional. So that requires good indicators to help track progress across different dimensions. And just really shortly, I'll share a few of the different dimensions that we often look at. And those include environment and climate. So looking at indicators that measure improvements in terms of the environment, natural resources, climate change, or adaptation capacities. One example of this could be improvements in natural resource sustainability, biodiversity, or conservation, and looking at species habitat quality and things like that, or even improved disaster response capacities. And then peace and security indicators, these can measure improvements in terms of conflict management or prevention, peace building. One example is better conflict mediation capacities, better social cohesion and relationships, levels of intra or intercommunity trust, willingness to cooperate, and things like that. That's what you're looking to measure here. And then a third dimension that we often try to look at is development and livelihoods. So looking at indicators that can help you measure improvements in terms of livelihood and economic development. For example, looking at increased access to more climate resilient livelihood options, improved access to credit, finance, or even things like increased income. So not the easy question or very straightforward. How do we know if a security risk is connected to a climate impact? Listen to people, and you can monitor these things as well to really see not only if security risk is connected to a climate impact, but how these potential risks could be addressed in order to build peace and kind of go towards this positive narrative.
No, I like the way how you tied that into a neat little bowl, even though it would be a much more complex answer. No, I like it. M&E angle makes a lot of sense. And also lately we've been seeing that the M&E has expanded to MEL now, the monitoring, evaluation,
and learning.
Yeah, which is really good. And it reflects the fact that we need to even go back into that process with what we've learned about it, adapt it, correct it, and make it better next time, adding that as a dimension. That's already kind of implied in the monitoring evaluation, but it can't be implied. It has to be clear, right? And I think that's why it gained its own letter. But I mean, of course, the entire monitoring and evaluation process is about that, is about you gaining understanding of what you've done, which is neglected part of work. We don't tend to go back and look at what we've done, but we should. We definitely should.
Yeah.
Also think about it when we're budgeting for projects, what we're thinking of, what is the time frame of a project. We often forget to calculate the time needed for that. Then it's too late, the project's finished, and you can't do it, and you have to already start a new one. So very, very good that you brought that up. And maybe, I think the next question is, I'll give it to you because then you can continue on the drive that you are, the very good one. Why does climate drive conflict in some places, but not in others?
Ooh, this is another one. I love anytime, I guess, bringing in the weathering risk methodology and these frameworks is also just fun to talk about things within this framework, because when it all fits, it's very satisfying, and also helps reiterate the importance of, we developed this guidance document and tools, and not only is it important and other organizations can use these documents to help with their assessments, but it's also very helpful for us when addressing these questions to have this kind of framework. And I think, why does climate drive conflicts in some places but others? And bingo, because I'm going to talk about context factors now. And these
Like
context...
you predicted. You always knew it.
I knew
There
it.
it
I
is.
knew context factors will always come up, especially if I've talked about anything related to methodology or seen that this is a section in things that people are interested in. We're coming back to it. So context factors shape vulnerability and resilience, which we talked about a bit earlier in this episode, to climate and security risks. And these include a variety of factors like gender equality and social inclusion. And they play a very important role in all of the climate security pathways, are always at the center of the different analyses that we do. So research into the links between climate change and conflict has identified a number of these important context factors that shape how these risks play out. They're often factors that increase vulnerability and the risks of climate impacts and contribute to instability, conflict when they're deficient or they're weak, but they also can increase the resilience of communities, societies, and states to withstand compounding climate security risks. And some examples of these factors that kind of play this decisive role in how and if climate change can drive conflict in different places include economic, social, political, legal factors, as well as some demographic factors. So when it comes to economic factors, things like economic assets, access to opportunities, the climate sensitivity of different economic activities that the economy hinges on, as well as access to different markets and trade relationships. These things shape how a society, how a community can cope with climate change. And also things like social factors that include gender equality, social inclusion, but also the strength of social relationships and cohesion within a society and how people can or cannot rely on one another. And political and legal factors, I think these are often the ones that are most discussed. So these include things like governance, political freedoms, opportunities for participation in political life, also state-citizen relationships, very importantly, trust in public institutions, both formal, informal, and traditional mechanisms that manage disputes, access to things like public services, as well as international treaties that can govern things like natural resources. All of these play a very key role. And then lastly, demographic factors, which can include the demographic makeup of society from age, different like social groups, as well as trends like population size, density, growth, and urbanization and age composition of the population. All of these factors shape vulnerability, resilience of societies, and how climate change manifest, if it drives conflict or if maybe it doesn't in a specific context.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like we were talking before about fragility, right? Is fragility
Exactly.
there? Very good. Should we jump into our next question?
Yeah, I think we got quite a few questions about some challenges.
Yeah, let's look into those. What stakeholders oppose the climate peace and security agenda and why?
Take it away, Raquel. That one is a tough one.
It's a tough one. Thought a lot about it because I think we can confidently say that the climate peace and security agenda has really reached the mainstream. It's not a secret. And I think it's because every single context is being impacted by it in some way. It's not just your typical food insecurity hitting after a drought. You have also other dynamics like relating to communities that are hosting displaced people in the aftermath of climate impacts. You have slow onset impacts like unreliable harvests. And this is something that also affects industrialized countries, right? So we're yet to find a country that can claim to not be affected by security impacts of climate change. And I think this is why acceptance of this agenda is so broad. It's just so relatable. And the message has hit home to almost everyone, but of course, not absolutely everyone is on board. And I think we can say that there is a pattern behind this. And one is more obvious, and we can just get it out of the way, which are climate deniers. Of course, anyone who doesn't believe that climate change is a real thing, they wouldn't believe that it can impact security, of course. This is a very clear case. But luckily, this is a minor group. People who don't believe climate change exists is not really representative of the global population. So if we take people who deny the existence of climate change to the side, I think we're left with one of the biggest groups that are still opposing the climate peace and security agenda. And I say that there is a pattern, it's a very specific one. I would define them as middle high income countries that have relatively large shares in the global economy and at the same time, very high stakes on high emitting sectors. So 3 characteristics there.
Like everyone now has to guess and see which group of countries you could be referring to.
Exactly. I'll give you 1 second to guess. Well, we're talking about the BRICS countries, right? They're Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There could be others out there, but because these are so geographically important, they also have very important sectors, very engaged on the international trade system to different extents amongst each other, but still they fall into these 3 categories of being middle to high income countries and so forth. The opposition is very clear amongst these countries. And I think Russia is the most adamant about it from all of them. They have already exercised veto powers in the Security Council when the resolution on climate security was brought to debate. And they also just in general, they vehemently oppose it whenever they can, whenever it comes up. China takes actually a different approach because they often abstain from the discussions because they don't want to necessarily support the agenda, but they also don't right out dismiss it like Russia does. And I think this has to do with the fact that China still has an interest in having some form of international leadership on climate issues. And then we have India and Brazil. India and Brazil, they generally make similar points that we shouldn't be securitizing climate change, which is a point that Russia also makes, by the way. But Brazil and India, they approach it much less passionately. And it feels like they're just not interested in this agenda and also don't believe they've caused the problem. So they don't think they should have to stop their own development to clean it up. It's also, I think, a stronger argument from the part of these 2 countries. We all know this argument. It's a difficult one to make stick nowadays, to be honest, because it does make sense that countries with biggest responsibilities should take a bigger hit in the cost for solving the problem. We know that. That's why there's the loss and damage discussion. They are leaning on these arguments. They're good arguments. They're cogent. They make sense. But it doesn't make sense that countries get to cause the problem in order to equalize this kind of responsibility. So that second part of the argument doesn't make sense. Oh, now we get to pollute. No one gets to pollute because this is a global problem, right? It's an old argument. It's kind of weak. And I feel like it's time to put it to rest. We have to approach things differently nowadays. But it's still a position that India and Brazil take. And there is some kernels of truth in it. And that's why it still sticks to an extent. And then we have South Africa. And I really wish I could say more about South Africa. I was researching to answer this question and I realized how little I know about South Africa in this specific context, which might have to do with the fact that it hasn't been in the Security Council for over a decade, since 2011, 2012. So we didn't really get to see it positioning itself. I think most of what we take internationally from countries and their position come from their position in the Security Council, and South Africa hasn't been there. So we didn't really get to see their position generally is exposed by the BRICS positions, like bundled together. And it could be that it doesn't really accurately reflect the country's own take. So I'm not going to venture too much on this.
No, I think that that's good. And also an interesting point that you bring up about South Africa, especially in the context of the African Union and it working to build this common African position on climate peace and security. And I think here, because this analysis that serves as the basis of this is also a comparative analysis between the different regions throughout Africa, is maybe some of these things, especially in this conversation, aren't as clear, especially in comparison to these other BRICS countries. Maybe that will become more transparent as that report is launched and as the African Union also works to build a unified and a common position on the topic. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned, yeah. And another point that I wanted to make, I mean, we can understand why BRICS countries being on the opposite side of this agenda, also has to do with the fact that they're right in the middle, right in this development stage where you can easily fall above or fall below the development line. So if something happens in the economy, you can either go up or go down really quickly. It's not a very established industrialized country. It's not a least developed country where you know you can't cross that line. So you're always kind of in the middle. And if those big industries, which are also high emitting, will take a big hit, you can easily fall below the development line. So I think that's probably a key reason why BRIC countries have a little bit of, are holding off on supporting the agenda, even if they amongst them have different ways to position themselves. But there might be other stakeholders out there, Alex. Maybe you have something to say.
Yeah. I think when I first saw this question, I also first thought about some of the different countries, these debates that happen at the UNSC, but it also makes me think of different kind of international fora like the Berlin Climate and Security Conference, and how part of our focus is bringing in different sectors as well. And part of that from this year, working to have a little bit of a stronger focus on traditional security actors and kind of bringing them together with the climate people, bringing people together from kind of the HDP nexus, all different sectors that have a role to play in these areas. And I don't know if when it comes to different sectors, I would use the phrasing of opposing the climate, peace, and security agenda and why, because I don't know, different sectors also aren't around a table at the UNSC actively having to vote in favor or against.
Maybe a bit of a resistance or
yeah,
something like
maybe
this.
resistance is a better phrasing. But I think, especially when it comes to traditional security actors, we see kind of things from two different dimensions. Of one, you have the actual climate mitigation aspect of it, and traditional security actors being such high emitters and needing to kind of do their role not to make different situations worse by furthering the impacts of climate change and frequency of these kind of extreme weather events, but also how does the role of traditional security actors change when threats to peace and security are fundamentally different currently now in 2024 than they were when a lot of these different traditional security organizations were founded, and how does this role change? And I think those are interesting questions to explore. And also hopefully this year at BCSC will bring together a lot of those different actors to work on also speaking a bit of a common language and coming together to have these conversations not around each other, but actually with each other.
Very holistic.
Yeah, we love a holistic response and creates a more sustainable response as well. I mean, especially a lot of different actors have, even when it comes to like actors who work on peace, have very different mandates of when they can come in and the role that they can play, even from things like peacemaking and peace building. Working with different actors along the spectrum is incredibly important, and also integrating development actors as well, because then there are certain mandates that, say, peace building organizations can't fulfill that need development actors to come in and help execute and, say, like, builds the infrastructure that is needed in different contexts.
You're already giving a sneak peek to a question that we have later on. A very good question. Yeah, but that's already gives an overview. Before we move to that topic, which is super interesting on the holistic response, it's going to bring us more to the solution side of things. We still have one more question related to what we were talking just right now. How to respond when stakeholders bring up the securitizing of climate change?
That's a good point, especially on opposition. Sometimes it's not so much opposition to climate, peace, and security, but the securitization of climate change itself, and that can create a lot of conflict.
Yes, and I'm guessing the person who asked this question has been in a panel, because if you've ever been or if you listen to a panel that is talking about climate and security in some form, you've heard that question from the audience on how to keep climate change from being securitized, from being militarized. I think this is an important question, and it was a very important question also a few years ago, because with the agenda was taking the first steps, and a lot of people worried that climate change becomes just an additional argument for a state to invade another and engage in war, right? Like, oh, you're not
so peaceful.
Not so peaceful. So I think when people heard the word security and they wanted to make sure that that's not what we're talking about, they had a point, and it's an important point. But at the same time has passed. The agenda has already evolved, and it evolved, I think, with these considerations in mind. So it was good that people brought this up at the time. But today we have a much more clear knowledge of what the agenda means, and that there's nothing in this climate, peace, and security narrative that supports militarized action in the name of climate. And we know that now. The agenda is different. It brings attention to risks climate change can pose to security, and it brings attention to opportunity that climate and peace approaches have to support and strengthen each other. That's what the agenda is about. So if we see that someone is looking to use climate security as an argument to wage war, frankly, unfortunately, they were going to do it anyway, and they're just looking for a scapegoat. So if it wouldn't be climate security, it would be something else. Unfortunately, it's just something that it's out of our control to have things being instrumentalized, but it's not part of the agenda and how the agenda was conceptualized. It's not what people mean when they're talking about climate, peace, and security. I think that's the point. And I mentioned this is something that comes up a lot amongst the BRICS countries. It's something that the leaders of these countries really hold on to. Even if we say this argument has been debunked a million times, we already explained that's not what it's about. But they do hold on to it. And I think this is simply because it's difficult to oppose to the climate security agenda, the climate peace and security agenda. We can say that that's the only angle that you can really hold on to if you're trying to oppose the agenda, if you're trying to resist to it. So coming back to the question, how can I respond to it if it comes up? I think that ultimately, even if you give the best, the most eloquent answer to explain it in the best way possible, fill it with practical examples, you have a solid logic, it might still not work, because if you're an actor that is seeking to utilize this argument in order to delay action, you're not really going to get to convince anyone. So state the facts, state what the agenda is about, and kind of let it be. People will do what they're going to do.
And I think this idea of responding to these risks of securitization of climate change also highlight the importance of this climate peace and security that we talked about a little bit earlier, especially this integration of peace, I think makes it a lot easier for people to take up the agenda as well. I think one good example of this is at the last COP in the UAE, how there was this first day that did focus on, I think we would all say climate security, but the framing that worked was climate relief, recovery, and peace. And how many times did you hear it's the first peace day at COP? And I think this really goes a long way, and it's so much easier to get buy-in. We saw within the declaration that came out of this and was launched on that day, has so many country signatories, has so many also organizational signatories that were able to buy into this. And I think that framing is helpful in these international spaces as well when you're trying to do something in a multilateral space.
And you know what? At the end of the day, we're just trying to get people to talk about these risks and how to stop them and how to build peace. We don't really care. So if you're dealing with a very strong resistance about a word, just drop that word and use another one that works, whatever works.
In the end, we want people to talk about these topics and look at things like food security, health, disaster preparedness, and recovery from these kinds of instances. If the phrasing climate security isn't used, I don't think that's the goal.
We have fragility, we have vulnerability, we have a food security that is one way of talking about security that is very clearly related to human security. We don't have to explain, it's like self-explanatory. So that helps. Gets people talking about what matters.
We always talk about entry points within climate security pathways. And also very important is figuring out, okay, what kind of narrative works as an entry point? Because that can also be adapted.
It's also a way of us, we're part of this community that often builds these narratives and work on developing these narratives. We also have to be humble enough to understand that it's not our role to push them on every single actor. And this is the same about going to a farmer and talking about climate change when you actually should be talking about their fish and about their harvest. It's a little bit the same. And if other countries are uncomfortable with it, that's fine. We can adapt. And now I get to talk about something that I find more interesting in the sense that it's a little bit more solution oriented. A super good question. I'm guessing someone who already confronted this problem. How can practitioners, they didn't say which practitioners, just practitioners in general, how can practitioners overcome financing and mandate silos to boost integrated action? So yeah, difficult one because you're getting financing for a project, it's earmarked for something specific. And you
get
yourself,
one word,
right?
one word response.
Exactly. One word response. How?
Go for it.
Co-benefits.
Is that 2 words? No,
Is
it's
it
just
2 words?
hyphenated. It's just
Exactly.
hyphenated.
Is hyphenate, does it make it one word?
Yes.
So it's either 1 or 2 words. 1 word, co-benefits. So anyhow, what we mean is that the focus on co-benefits is probably the most practical way to deal with silos. I'm not saying it's an absolute solution that works in every single case, but it is a practical approach, right? Because the alternative to co-benefits would be a paradigm shift in the operational structure of international organizations, that something that would allow practitioners that have completely different mandates to cooperate in a way that maybe contradicts their individual mandates. So we would need an absolute paradigm shift for this to be possible, or in the financing side to get donors to see the benefit of holistic interventions that address these underlying causes, that are aiming for structural long-term change instead of what we would generally want, which is fast and measurable results. So you would also need a paradigm shift for this to be possible. Those are great things to aim for, but we can't only go for those because they're very difficult. So I think we can agree that it's very difficult objectives if you're just trying to address both climate impact and conflict risks, let's say between 2 communities, and you're in a conflict affected region, you're in a fragile country, and you need to make this project work. You have a small budget, you have 2 years from start to finish. That's not what you're going to go for.
Yeah, you're not working to build towards systems change with a 2-year time frame. That's a very good point. And I think co-benefits also then allow for practitioners to maintain the focus on their mandates, on the focus of their projects towards these main objectives that are set out for them, but also looking for implementation approaches that simultaneously harbor benefits to other areas that you're looking to address, like with these different interventions. And this may seem a bit far-fetched in the sense that it's already difficult to achieve the core results of the project without trying to add any further goals, pressures. But I think we actually do this all the time already, thinking of things like inclusion, especially within gender and youth. It's really hard nowadays to think of a climate security approach that wouldn't in some way integrate considerations for avoiding harm and including marginalized and affected populations. This has become common practice globally. And if you're looking for examples of how to foster things like co-benefits, do look at what organizations working on climate and security are doing in this inclusion, gender, and youth space, because it's definitely there.
True. I think the inclusion is a great example, in fact, because we are doing it, right? We are
Just
already
automatically. It's integrated into everything. And for example, within weathering risk, all of the data that we use is gender disaggregated, just as a default. And that's already a measure that's built into the methodology, and just one example of the ways that these are just common practice. No one sits down and thinks, how should we do it this time? It just becomes, this is the best way to go about it, and comes up with the best results.
And it is a co-benefit. I think perhaps people didn't realize that they were already doing it. There are other projects, other organizations out there also following similar methodologies, or at least similar logic, so to say, even if they have different methodologies. And I think that what we're trying to achieve is that every security or peace building measure will be climate sensitive and the other way around, having conflict sensitivity embedded in our projects. This is already co-benefit. It's a form of co-benefit, and it doesn't necessarily mess with your core goal. So it doesn't change your mandate, doesn't change the core goal of your project. And you don't have to kind of justify. You're just making sure that the approach already does that. And something else for you to report. I mean, it's not a bad thing at all.
Yeah, that's very true. And also sometimes the goal is, in terms of co-benefits, to be climate sensitive or conflict sensitive. It doesn't mean that within a climate adaptation project, you need to have a goal that is incredibly lofty, or you want to say, oh, and we've fostered like social cohesion. Part of the goal can just be to not make things worse. So it doesn't always need to be the second gold medal, but just working on integrating these things throughout.
True. Now, do you want to give it a go at the climate risk assessments?
Yeah, I mean, we did get one, not final question, but the last one that was on our list is, how do climate risk assessments help people on the ground? And I think here I also, just given the phrasing, wasn't sure if people are talking about people who are part of the affected communities and how things like assessments help them, or how can different organizations that are active in these contexts use assessments to help inform their work. And I guess it goes both ways. In general, the goal with climate risk assessments are also better policy, better programming. So hopefully it will see things like increase in social cohesion, more access to different forms of livelihoods, economic benefits for people living in these communities that are affected. But also the goal with how we develop our entry points is also to help give organizations the tools to identify different measures to help people. And these can include things like programming to provide different livelihood opportunities, different measures to make things conflict sensitive within their projects. It can really be a variety of different things depending on the assessment, but the goal is always tangible entry points. And hopefully we provide these things.
And tying also back with what you said in the beginning, people-centered approach, getting these informations from the people. I mean, if you want to help people, you need to know what they need help with and not
exactly
try to
come
guess
in and
with your own perceptions. Oh, no, they need help with this. No, people have to tell you what they need help with.
Yeah, I think maybe that's one of the best points to end on is, okay, we're talking the phrasing, how do climate risk assessments help people? When it comes down to it, like the climate risk assessments will be helpful, but people will tell you what they need. And then the goal with the rest of the assessment is to address that. So it isn't so much that, okay, something has magically come about.
Whatever I perceive as an external person as being an issue, right?
But because these qualitative approaches and different interviews and asking people, okay, what are the risks? What is needed? It makes it so the assessments are directly in response to these things and can be beneficial.
Very good. I like this episode. It was a fun format, something to try out. Love to have this interaction with some of our listeners that sent us questions. That was really cool.
That was fun. Thanks, Raquel. What a nice conversation.
Very good. So thank you so much for listening. We will see you in about a month. Happy vacation. If you have summer vacation, if you're in the global north and having some summer vacation, enjoy. If not, enjoy it anyways, wherever you are.
Enjoy the time of year.
Yes. See you before BCSC.
Bye.
Bye.
This was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We will be back with another episode in a few weeks. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.